It's 1958, and Germany has just launched the world's first artificial satellite, marking the beginning of the space race. The USA, not wanting to be outdone, began working heavily on their mission to get to the moon, but not before launching their own satellite called Explorer 1. The German Empire also started sending animals to space to test if it was safe for humans. Meanwhile, in East Russia, the nation had been placed under a military government led by former Russian General Georgy Zhukov since the split in 1945. Because of this, the Free Russian Republic was suffering economically. Zhukov promised to bring democracy back to Russia and restore it to its former glory. But as time went by, Zhukov's promises started becoming more and more unlikely as the Russian people began losing faith in him. In 1960, Socialist Party member Nikita Khrushchev became the first president of Free Russia. Speaking of 1960, guess which decade we're in now? Oh boy, do we have a lot to cover here. The 1960s was extremely eventful and somewhat chaotic. Let's start in Russia. Khrushchev had just become president and promised to reform Russia and fulfill the promises that Zhukov made. Zhukov would die in 1961, by the way. Khrushchev began fixing the economy and making social and industrial reforms. He also began a nuclear program for Russia. These things were scaring the Germans living in West Russia, the German puppet. There were some downsides to his presidency, though. Khrushchev wanted nothing to do with Germany or West Russia, and so he began construction on a massive wall that would stretch from the Ural Mountains down to the Caspian Sea. The Ural Wall, it was called, would divide the Russian people for 30 years, and with nobody being allowed to move between the two Russias, countless families were torn apart. Khrushchev also focused on Russia's foreign policy, to go against the Germans as much as possible. East Russia allied themselves with the US and joined NATO in 1962, along with Mexico and eventually Nicaragua. Soon after, East Russia also began sending aid to the US in the Indochina War, eventually sending their own men to help. East Russia also began allying themselves with China. Speaking of Indochina, the US began making gains and soon pushed down south. Back in 1960, John F. Kennedy became the U.S. president, and in his inaugural address, he assured the American people that there was nothing to fear. There can be peace with the Germans. I plan to reach that peace as soon as possible. Yet if a peace is not settled, I plan to do what is best for this country. The United States shall not fail. We will never falter, even when our international relations reach the lowest of lows. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, 1961. Unfortunately, relations did eventually reach the lowest of lows. Germany had a constant need for expansion and a constant need for nuclear weapons. In 1961, they annexed Denmark, and Iceland and Greenland became German territories. The German Empire, now being within a closer range to the US, placed their nuclear rockets on Greenland. When the US government found out about this, they completely lost their marbles. The Germans could now easily conduct a nuclear attack on the US, and Washington, D.C. came under threat. This event would today be known as the Greenlandic Missile Crisis. In response to this, Kennedy placed the US nuclear missiles in Portugal. Both NATO and the IEU were freaking out. October 1962 was the closest the world came to World War III. That was until the Germans sent an ultimatum to the US, saying that they would remove their missiles from Greenland if they removed theirs from Portugal. Not wanting to potentially end the human race, the US agreed, and the whole world blew a huge sigh of relief. The American people soon began to realize that nuclear and hydrogen bombs were dangerous, especially after learning that Germany had just tested the world's most powerful hydrogen bomb, called the Kaiser bomb. Peace protests began taking place across the US, and this would mark the beginning of the hippie movement, which would join the feminist and African-American rights demonstrations. In 1963, famous African-American Martin Luther King Jr. marched on Washington, D.C. and made his famous I Have a Dream speech, which changed the US perception of colored people. The end of the Greenlandic Missile Crisis would not be the end of German expansion. By this point, the US government became almost certain that Germany may want to take its overseas territories and other independent countries in the Pacific and Caribbean, and in October of 1963, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Guam became the 51st, 52nd, and 53rd US states. On November 22, 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was shot in the city of Dallas, Texas. He died soon after. As the nation mourned, his vice president Lyndon B. Johnson became president. Johnson made sure that he fulfilled the things that the Kennedy administration didn't. He passed the Civil Rights Act in Congress in 1964, granting rights to people of color and women in the U.S., and swiftly ending segregation. Also in 1964, China and East Russia tested their first nuclear bombs. To create more balance, Germany gave nukes to West Russia and Middle Africa. The US and Germany kept on testing nukes mainly in the Pacific Ocean to the point where it began affecting the climate. In 1965, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Organization was formed between the nuclear nations on both sides to see what could be done. Meanwhile, in the failing Ottoman Empire, independence movements were exploding all over the Mesopotamian, Nile, and Levantine regions. The people here wanted to join the United Republic of Arabia, the people over here wanted independence, the people over here also wanted independence, and the people here wanted Egyptian reunification. Speaking of Egypt, the Italians were also failing. Ethiopia had a revolution in 1952 and declared independence. Italy and Egypt and Greece were also revolting and breaking free. The Italian people soon realized that fascism was an extremely flawed system, and now old Mussolini was overthrown in 1965. This gave Egypt, Greece, and Libya a chance to gain independence. With this independence, Ottoman Egypt got extremely twitchy, with the Egyptian people becoming more and more restless by the day. This began the Second Arab Revolt, a bloody conflict that raged in the Mesopotamian and Levantine regions. This revolt would be even more deadly than the first one. Ottoman Egypt was repatriated to Egypt in 1966. The Levant region would declare independence in 1968, and Al-Kuwait would join the Arabs. Iraq and Syria would still take years of fighting and battling, as the cities of Baghdad and Damascus would become bloodbaths. Back in Indochina, the US carried out the Tet Offensive against the Germans. It was a bloody and awful campaign, however they managed to gain most of Vietnam. In 1968, the German government ordered the evacuation of all German colonists from the city of Saigon in the south as Vietnamese rebels approached. Once Saigon was taken in January of 1969, the Vietnamese officially declared independence. What was left of German Indochina, Laos, and Cambodia grew tired of Germany mistreating them, and they broke free in 1969, ending the bloody Indochina War in an American victory. Lots of blood had been shed, and eventually a memorial would be built to canonize the thousands of soldiers who had died. There was one war, however, which the US wasn't doing so good at: the space race. Germany had already sent the first man into space in August of 1960 and had been making massive leaps during the decade as the US fell behind. In May of 1969, the final nail had been hammered into the coffin. Germany launched their special lunar rocket mission, and on May 20th, 1969, the world watched in astonishment as the German astronaut Otto Becker became the first man to walk on the moon. As he placed the German flag on the surface, he said his famous speech that is still remembered to this day. For years man has looked to the night sky, for years man has wondered, but now man has taken a great step, a step that shall one day take us to the edge of the universe. I take this step for both my country and mankind. Otto Becker, 1969. When the Germans landed on the moon in 1969, many around the world, even in the US, took it less as a win for Germany, but more as an achievement for mankind. US President Richard Nixon did not take it so lightly, according to telephone recordings from the Oval Office. You know what they're going to be saying in the New York Times tomorrow? Kennedy started the moon race, Johnson ran it, and then Nixon tripped at the goal line. That's what it's going to be. They're going to try and pin this loss on me. But they're not going to succeed, no sir. I'll tell you that right goddamn now. Not Nixon. Not Nixon. US President Richard Nixon, 1969. The US government and NASA did not take no for an answer, and they started preparing for their own mission in the hopes that they would one day build an American moon base. The US then launched their first rocket to the moon in July of 1969 called Apollo 11, with Neil Armstrong being the first American on the moon. It wasn't much of an achievement in the grand scheme of things, however, as Nixon put it, it was a step towards establishing an American military base and even a colony on the moon. The Germans got wind of this and started planning the same thing. Back in Asia, the Republic of China began growing its influence. It had allied itself with the USA and the Free Russian Republic, and it introduced more trading ties with Mongolia, Korea, Tibet, and Vietnam. They also began expanding their nuclear arsenal. Also in 1968, Khrushchev had won a second term in East Russia. Due to his re-election and the German defeat in Indochina at the hands of East Russia and America, tensions started building up at the Ural Wall and the neutral Russian buffer zone, with border guards ordered to shoot anyone crossing into the other country's territory. Tensions began rising between the two Russias. MLK was also assassinated in the US, causing riots to break out across the country. Lastly, the 1960s would see the rise of a new up-and-coming sci-fi genre called alternate history, with many people wondering things like, what if the Entente won World War I, or what if the Allies won World War II, etc., with even me looking at those subjects in the past. But anyways, enough of that, it's time for the 70s. The 1970s saw the rise of new styles of music like rock and pop. Color TV was starting to become more of a thing, and of course, Germany and America were still at each other's throats. The Germans had a constant need for expansion to survive as a colonial and imperial power, and the USA just couldn't accept that. The 1970s also started promoting things like North African decolonization, especially with Spain. With the introduction of more moderate and liberal reforms of the government, Spain gave Morocco and Spanish West Africa independence in 1971. Nigeria would also gain semi-independence from Germany. Back in the Ottoman Empire, the Second Arab Revolt raged on, with guerrilla warfare being fought between the Ottoman army and the Iraqi rebels. The Syrians were successfully crushed by this point. The Ottoman Empire quickly turned to Germany for help, but Germany was like, sorry, I'm busy. From there, Ottoman and German relations would begin to sour in what would be known as the German-Ottoman split. The Ottomans would give up with the Arab Revolt and surrender to the Iraqi freedom fighters, and with that, the Islamic Republic of Iraq was founded in 1972. The Ottomans realized that it was time to call it a day on imperialism. Their empire was breaking apart, and there was some serious governmental reforms that needed to happen. In 1973, the Ottoman Empire officially became a parliamentary constitutional monarchy and changed its name to the Ottoman Republic. Back in Iraq, post-war trauma was making it hard for the country to form a proper government. The cities and villages were destroyed, run down, and dilapidated due to the war, and the people were heavily demoralized. This demoralization would allow Iraq to eventually become a dictatorship. In Russia, tensions in the Ural Mountains were reaching a breaking point with the wall. In Moscow, the Germans held a military parade in 1972, and an old Kaiser Wilhelm III made a speech to the Russian people. If the Easterners want nuclear rockets, let them have them. If they want to take all of the Ural Mountains, let them take them. But O people of the state of Russia, never let them take away your independence, your patriotism, your will to fight. Let there be no panic or fear. With the German Empire at your side, Russia will never falter. Kaiser Wilhelm III of Germany, 1972. The German Kaiser would die in August of 1975 at the age of 93 and would be replaced by his eldest son, who would become known as Kaiser Louis. Back in America, Nixon had lost the election of 1972 to Democrat Ted Kennedy, who was also the brother of the late John Kennedy. He had lost mainly due to his handling of America's loss in the space race and his inclusion of the new Watergate scandal. Kennedy became president and decided to pardon Nixon despite all this. In 1976, history was made as the US set up the first military base on the moon. The Germans were quick to do the same. It was almost like the Cold War had extended off the planet. These bases would later on expand throughout the 80s and 90s. Also in 1974, India and Pakistan had both gained nuclear weapons. Back to Germany, however, the new Kaiser Louis had less of a radical expansionist stance than his father and looked at things in a more liberal way. In Africa, German Middle Africa was beginning to crack, with independence movements in Zimbabwe, Kenya, West Africa, and Madagascar. There were even small rebellions in the jungles of the Congo by socialist Congolese freedom fighters who wanted to topple the Middle Africa government and, just like Indochina, end European rule in Africa. Now here's the thing about imperialism and why it doesn't work. When you've grown to such an extent that you're the world's most powerful nation/empire, with one of the world's largest militaries and nuclear arsenals, to the point where there's no more room to expand, the only way you can go from there is down.